Lance wasn't the kind of man who turned heads when he walked into a room. He wasn't loud, nor did he command attention with a booming voice or exaggerated gestures. His presence was quiet, steady, like the calm before a storm, or, more often, the calm after one. At 37, he had lived enough life to understand that strength didn't come from how much you could carry, but from how far you were willing to go for the people you loved. For Lance, that meant everything. He worked as a lineman for the local power company, a job as dangerous as it was thankless. While others rushed to shelter during storms, Lance climbed poles, battled whipping winds, and restored light to homes. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave him something even more valuable: time. Time to be a father. Time to be present. His two daughters, Amelia, 8, and Rosie, 5, were the heart of his world. Each morning they filled the small, sunlit kitchen with their chatter and laughter, their voices bouncing off the pale yellow walls that Lance had painted himself the summer before. Amelia, with her boundless curiosity, peppered him with questions about the world. Why is the sky blue? Where does the moon go during the day? While Rosie clung to his leg, her shy smile peeking out from behind a curtain of curly hair. Being a single father wasn't part of the plan. It never is. When his wife, Claire, passed away 3 years ago, Lance thought the world might stop spinning. It didn't. Instead, it tilted, forcing him to find a new balance, a new normal. The grief was still there, tucked into quiet moments when the girls were asleep, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, it fueled him. He had to be both mother and father, the nurturer and the disciplinarian, the dreamer and the realist. And so, each day, he laced up his work boots, kissed his daughters on the tops of their heads, and faced the world with a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. Lance's life wasn't extraordinary, but it was meaningful. He found joy in the small things. A Saturday afternoon spent building a treehouse with Amelia, Rosie's giggles as she played dress-up in his old shirts, the simple satisfaction of a hot cup of coffee before the chaos of the day began. He had traded in grand ambitions for a quieter purpose, to raise his daughters to be kind, brave, and curious. The town where they lived wasn't much. Just a cluster of homes, a grocery store, and a park with a creaky swing set. But it was enough. Lance liked the predictability of it, the way Mrs. Baker from next door always waved as he walked the girls to school, or how the clerk at the hardware store knew him by name. In a world that often felt chaotic and unkind, this little corner of stability was something Lance cherished deeply. But life has a way of shifting when you least expect it. Lance's quiet days were about to change, his steady rhythm disrupted by something, or someone, that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, about love, and about what it meant to move forward. It was late afternoon when Lance heard the frantic knock on his front door. He had just sat down with a cup of coffee. Amelia and Rosie sprawled on the floor, coloring books spread out like a rainbow explosion. Startled, he set the mug down and hurried to answer, finding Mrs. Baker, Eleanor, standing there pale and trembling. "Lance," she said, her voice thin and shaky, "I don't feel right." Without hesitation, he took her arm, steadying her as she swayed slightly on her feet. "Let's sit you down," he said gently, guiding her to the couch. She resisted, shaking her head. "No, I think I need a hospital," she whispered, clutching her chest. "Please." Her words sent a jolt of urgency through him. "Girls," he called over his shoulder, trying to keep his voice calm. "Stay here and keep playing. I'll be right back." Grabbing his phone from the counter, Lance dialed 911. His hands were steady, his voice clear as he relayed the situation to the dispatcher. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet neighborhood, and paramedics were at the door. Lance stayed close, holding Eleanor's hand as they helped her onto a stretcher. "You'll be okay," he assured her, though the tightness in his chest betrayed his own worry. "I'll follow behind. Do you have anyone I should call?" Eleanor hesitated, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Call me Anita," she said softly, her voice catching. "It's my name. Everyone calls me Mrs. Baker, but call me Anita." Lance nodded, offering her a small smile. "Okay, Anita, who should I call for you? Family? A friend?" She exhaled shakily. "My sister Mildred. She works at City Hall. She'll know what to do." The ambulance doors closed with a finality that made Lance's stomach twist, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. Back inside, he quickly explained the situation to Amelia and Rosie, instructing them to lock the door behind him and call him if they needed anything. Then, with Anita's old address book in hand, he made his way to City Hall. Mildred Baker turned out to be a formidable woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and an air of authority. She was standing at the front desk, engaged in a discussion with a coworker when Lance approached. "Excuse me," he said, clearing his throat. "Are you Mildred Baker?" She turned, her gaze immediately narrowing with suspicion. "Who's asking?" "I'm Lance. I live next door to Anita, your sister. She's in the hospital. She asked me to find you." The words seemed to drain the color from Mildred's face. "What happened?" "She wasn't feeling well. I called an ambulance. They've taken her to the hospital for tests." Mildred grabbed her purse, her professional demeanor replaced by raw concern. "Thank you for letting me know. Let's go." At the hospital, Lance and Mildred found Anita resting in a stark white room, her face still pale, but her smile warm. "Lance," she murmured as they entered, "you're a good man." "I'm just glad you're okay," he replied. But as Mildred sat beside her sister and Lance quietly stepped back, he realized something. Helping Anita wasn't just about being a good neighbor. It was a reminder that community was what held them all together, even in the hardest times. And for Lance, who often felt like he carried the weight of the world alone, this was a moment that unexpectedly lightened his own burden. The next morning, after breakfast, Lance told the girls about Anita being in the hospital. Rosie's eyes grew wide, and Amelia immediately jumped up from the table. "We should make her a card daddy," she declared, her 8-year-old voice filled with determination. Lance couldn't help but smile. "That's a great idea. Let's do it." The three of them gathered around the kitchen table, crayons, markers, and construction papers scattered everywhere. Amelia wrote in big, bold letters, "Get well soon, Mrs. Baker." Rosie added her own touch, a colorful drawing of a flower with a smiling sun in the corner. Lance admired their work and tucked the cards safely into his jacket pocket before they set out for the hospital. When they arrived, Anita was sitting up in bed, her face still pale but showing a flicker of strength. Her expression softened the moment she saw the girls shyly peeking around Lance's legs. "These must be your little ones," Anita said, her voice warm despite its weakness. "Aren't they precious?" Amelia stepped forward, holding out the card. "We made this for you, Mrs. Baker," she said. Anita's eyes glistened as she took the card, running her fingers over the colorful decorations. "Thank you, Amelia. Thank you, Rosie. This is the nicest thing anyone's done for me in a while." The girls beamed as Lance guided them to the chairs by the bed. He noticed Mildred standing by the window, her arms crossed. She turned when he approached, offering a small smile. "Thanks for coming back," Mildred said softly. "You didn't have to?" "Of course I did," Lance replied. "Anita's been a great neighbor, and besides..." He nodded toward his daughters. "They insisted." Mildred chuckled, her shoulders relaxing. "You're raising good kids." As the girls chattered with Anita, Lance and Mildred drifted into conversation. They discovered, to their surprise, that they both worked for the city. Lance had been a lineman for years, and Mildred, as it turned out, was an administrative coordinator in the municipal office. "How is it we've never run into each other before?" Mildred asked, her brow furrowed. Lance shrugged. "I guess we've just been in different circles. I'm usually out in the field, not much time to visit City Hall." "Maybe it's fate," she said lightly, though her expression held something more thoughtful. Before Lance could reply, the doctor entered. He was a tall man with a calm demeanor, holding a clipboard as he approached Anita's bedside. "Good news," the doctor announced. "It looks like you caught a nasty virus that caused your symptoms, but the antibiotics are working well. We're going to discharge you today, but you'll need a few days of rest and someone to help you at home." Anita glanced at Lance and Mildred, a look of quiet unease crossing her face. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. "You won't be," Lance assured her. "We're neighbors. That's what we're here for." "And family," Mildred added firmly. Later that afternoon, Lance helped Anita settle back into her cozy little home while the girls played with Mildred in the backyard. Over cups of tea, Lance and Mildred discussed a plan to ensure Anita had everything she needed during her recovery. They decided to alternate visits, with Lance taking care of meals and errands, while Mildred handled scheduling doctor follow-ups and checking in regularly. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Anita sat in her favorite chair, the Get Well card displayed proudly on her coffee table. She looked at Lance and Mildred, her voice tinged with gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you two." Lance smiled, glancing at Mildred. "We're just glad you're okay. That's what matters." For the first time in a long while, the house on the quiet street felt full. Not just of people, but of care, connection, and the kind of kindness that turns strangers into family. Lance didn't consider himself a man who needed much. Life had been stripped down to its essentials, his girls, his job, and his little routines that kept everything running smoothly. But as he found himself walking to Anita's house the next morning, balancing a tray of reheated lasagna he'd made the night before, he couldn't deny the unfamiliar hum of anticipation in his chest. Mildred would be there today, helping Anita sort through paperwork and organizing her medications. The girls had begged to come along, but school was starting in an hour. Lance promised they could visit after dinner, which had pacified them, barely. Now, walking alone in the crisp morning air, he wondered why he was so eager to see Mildred again. When he knocked, Anita's voice called out, "Come in, Lance." He nudged the door open with his foot and stepped inside. The scent of fresh coffee greeted him, mingled with the faint, comforting aroma of home, lavender cleaner, old wood, and something faintly floral. "Morning," he said, setting the tray on the kitchen counter. "Brought you some food." "Bless you," Anita said from her armchair, her voice still carrying the lingering rasp of illness. "I've got no energy to cook. You're a lifesaver." "It's just lasagna," Lance replied modestly. He glanced toward the dining table, where Mildred sat with her reading glasses perched on her nose, flipping through a stack of mail. She looked up, smiling. "Morning, Lance. Did you bake that yourself, or are you hiding a secret chef?" He chuckled. "Guilty. Cooking's one of the few things I can control in this madhouse of a life." Mildred laughed, a warm, melodic sound that seemed to settle the room. "You sound like me. There's something soothing about chopping vegetables after a long day of chaos." As the morning unfolded, the three of them settled into a comfortable rhythm. Lance fixed a loose kitchen cabinet door, while Mildred helped Anita go through her insurance paperwork. Conversation ebbed and flowed easily between them, talk of work, the girls, and even the weather. At one point, Mildred mentioned her love for hiking, her voice lighting up as she described her favorite trails just outside of town. Lance listened intently, surprised to find himself wanting to ask more questions, to know more about her. It wasn't just the way she spoke, though her enthusiasm was infectious. It was her presence. She was steady, capable, yet surprisingly gentle in a way that reminded him of Claire. The thought made him pause. It had been 3 years since he'd lost his wife, and while the grief had dulled, it hadn't disappeared. He wasn't sure he was ready to feel anything beyond it. Over the next few days, Lance and Mildred continued their tag-team care for Anita. As they spent more time together, their conversations grew more personal. One afternoon, after Lance had picked the girls up from school, he brought them to Anita's house. Mildred was there as always, and she greeted the girls with the same warmth and kindness that had become familiar over the past week. "Hi, Amelia. Hi, Rosie," she said, crouching to their level. "How was school today?" Amelia launched into a story about her art project, while Rosie shyly clung to Lance's leg. Mildred smiled and listened, her attention completely focused on the girls. It was a small thing, but it struck Lance how natural she seemed with them, how seamlessly she fit into their little world. Later, as the girls played in the backyard, Lance found himself sitting across from Mildred at the dining table, sipping coffee. "You're great with kids," he said. Mildred shrugged, her smile tinged with something bittersweet. "I always wanted kids, but life had other plans." Lance hesitated, sensing there was more to the story. "What happened?" She looked down at her coffee cup, her fingers tracing the rim. "I was married once. We tried for years, but it just didn't happen. Then, well, he left, said he couldn't handle it anymore." "I'm sorry," Lance said, his voice low. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. "It's okay. It was a long time ago. I've made peace with it, but I guess I've always wondered what it would have been like, having a family." Lance didn't know what to say. He couldn't imagine someone leaving Mildred. She was strong, compassionate, and fiercely independent. He admired her for that, and for the first time in years, he felt a pang of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: longing. As Anita grew stronger, Lance and Mildred's visits became less frequent, but their connection continued to deepen. They found excuses to talk: quick updates about Anita's health, questions about city work, even casual exchanges about the weather. Each conversation seemed to linger just a little longer than necessary. One evening, Lance found himself standing in his kitchen, phone in hand. He stared at Mildred's number, debating whether to call her. He wanted to invite her over, not for Anita, not for the girls, but for himself. He wanted to know more about her, to see if this quiet bond they'd formed could become something more. Before he could talk himself out of it, he pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Hey, Lance," she said, her voice warm. "What's up?" "Hi, Mildred," he began, his heart pounding. "I was wondering, are you free for dinner tomorrow? I know it's last minute, but the girls and I are having a little cookout. It'd be great to have you over." There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment, Lance worried he'd overstepped. But then she replied, her voice soft, "I'd love to." The next evening, Mildred arrived with a bottle of wine and a plate of homemade brownies. The girls greeted her with excitement, pulling her into their world of games and stories. Lance watched from the grill, a smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of completeness, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, their little family was growing. As the night wore on and the stars began to dot the sky, Lance and Mildred found themselves sitting on the porch, watching the girls chase fireflies in the yard. "Thank you for inviting me," Mildred said. This is nice." "It is," Lance agreed. He hesitated, then added, "You've been amazing these past few weeks, Mildred. I don't think Anita would have gotten through it without you." She smiled, her eyes soft. "We're a team, remember?" Lance chuckled. "Yeah, we are." For a moment, the only sound was the laughter of the girls and the chirping of crickets. Then Mildred turned to him, her expression serious. "Lance, what do you want?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this." She gestured toward the yard, the house, the two of them sitting there. "Where do you see this going?" He looked at her, his heart pounding. He didn't have an answer, not yet. But as he met her gaze, he realized he wanted to find out. Lance hesitated, the weight of Mildred's question settling over him like the summer night's warmth. He glanced toward the yard, where Amelia and Rosie were now huddled together, inspecting something glowing in Amelia's cupped hands. He smiled faintly, his gaze lingering on his daughters before returning to Mildred. "I don't know exactly," he admitted, his voice low, "but I know I like this. I like you." Mildred's lips parted slightly, and for a moment, Lance thought he'd misstepped, but then she reached out, her fingers brushing his arm lightly. "I like this too," she said softly. "And you." It wasn't a declaration or a promise, just a quiet acknowledgement of something unspoken but undeniable between them. Lance nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. For now, it was enough. The next few weeks passed in a blur of late summer activities. Mildred became a regular presence at Lance's house, joining them for dinners, weekend outings, and impromptu backyard adventures. Amelia and Rosie adored her, often begging her to stay longer or asking when she'd visit again. Anita, now fully recovered, watched the growing bond between Lance and her sister with a knowing smile, but refrained from commenting, at least for now. One Saturday, Lance suggested a hike, inspired by Mildred's earlier stories about her favorite trails. The girls were thrilled at the prospect of an adventure, and Mildred's enthusiasm was contagious. The trail wound through a dense forest, sunlight filtering through the leaves in dappled patterns. Amelia darted ahead, her boundless energy leading the way, while Rosie clung to Mildred's hand, chattering about her favorite animals. Lance walked a few steps behind, watching the three of them with a mixture of awe and gratitude. He hadn't realized how much he missed this, sharing moments of joy with someone who truly understood him. As they reached a clearing with a panoramic view of the valley below, Mildred turned to Lance, her cheeks flushed from the exertion. "This is what I needed," she said, her smile radiant. "Me too," Lance replied, his voice carrying more meaning than he intended. Mildred's eyes met his, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. But life, as always, had a way of complicating things. One evening, as Lance was putting the girls to bed, his phone buzzed with a message from Mildred. "Can we talk?" Something about the brevity of the text made his stomach twist. He replied quickly, inviting her over, and she arrived not long after, her expression tense. They sat in the living room, the house unusually quiet. Mildred fidgeted with her hands, a nervous habit Lance hadn't seen before. "What's going on?" he asked gently. She took a deep breath, meeting his eyes. "I've been offered a promotion at work." Lance blinked, caught off guard. "That's great news. Congratulations." Mildred hesitated. "It's in another city." The words hit Lance like a punch to the gut. "Oh," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How far?" "About 2 hours away," she replied. "It's a big opportunity, Lance. I'd be running the entire department." He nodded slowly, his mind racing. "Have you decided?" "I don't know," she admitted. "That's why I wanted to talk to you. It matters to me, but so does my career." Lance rubbed the back of his neck, trying to gather his thoughts. "Mildred, I won't stand in the way of your dreams. I care about you too much for that. But I also need to think about my girls. I can't just uproot them." "I'm not asking you to," she said quickly. "I'm just trying to figure out if there's a way to make this work." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears and unanswerable questions. Finally, Mildred stood, her expression conflicted. "I should go? I need to think." Lance nodded, watching her leave, his heart sinking with every step she took. In the days that followed, Lance threw himself into his routine, trying to ignore the ache in his chest. Mildred kept her distance, and though they exchanged polite messages about Anita or the girls, the warmth that had defined their relationship was missing. One evening, as he tucked Rosie into bed, she looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Daddy, is Miss Mildred still our friend?" Lance's throat tightened. "Of course she is, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" "She seems sad," Rosie said simply. Lance kissed her forehead, unable to find the right words. As he left the room, he realized that his daughters felt the tension as much as he did. Something had to change. The next day, Lance drove to Mildred's apartment. She answered the door, surprise flickering across her face. Lance, she said. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said firmly. "I've been thinking, and I don't want to lose what we have, not without trying." Mildred's eyes softened. "Neither do I." "Then let's figure this out together," Lance said. "Maybe you take the promotion and we visit on weekends. Maybe we find a way to make this distance thing work. But I don't want to let fear decide for us." Tears welled in Mildred's eyes as she stepped closer, her hand resting on his arm. "You mean that?" "I do," Lance said. "This matters to me. You matter." In the weeks that followed, Lance and Mildred worked out a plan. She accepted the promotion but arranged to split her time between the two cities, spending weekends in Lance's town. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a way to honor both their connection and their individual lives. For Lance, it meant something even deeper. After years of living in the shadow of loss, he was finally allowing himself to hope, to believe in the possibility of a new chapter, not just for him, but for his girls. And as they stood together on the porch one evening, watching Amelia and Rosie chase fireflies, Lance reached for Mildred's hand. She squeezed it gently, her smile radiant in the twilight. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. Mildred walked into the HR office of her prospective new job with mixed feelings. She had spent hours researching the position and imagining the possibilities it could bring. Yet, something in her gut felt off. The HR manager, a polished woman in a crisp blazer, welcomed her with a smile. But as the conversation unfolded, Mildred's excitement began to wane. The expectations of the role were far more demanding than the initial offer had suggested. It wasn't just about managing the department. It involved frequent travel, late nights, and an almost round-the-clock commitment to the job. The HR manager spoke casually about these requirements, as if they were minor inconveniences, but to Mildred, they loomed like warning signs. "And of course," the HR manager continued, "we'll need you available for any crises, even on weekends. The nature of this role requires a 24/7 mindset. Are you prepared for that?" Mildred hesitated. The picture of Lance and the girls flashed in her mind. Amelia's wide grin, Rosie's shy giggles, the peaceful evenings spent together. She had been so focused on the career opportunity that she hadn't fully considered what she might be giving up. "I'll need to think about it," Mildred said carefully, standing to shake the HR manager's hand. She left the office feeling a weight on her chest, her heart tugging her in a direction that was becoming increasingly clear. That evening, Mildred drove to Lance's house. The headlights swept across the front yard as she parked, and she could see Lance through the window, sitting at the dining table, helping Amelia with her homework, while Rosie doodled beside them. The sight brought a lump to her throat. When she knocked, Lance opened the door with a warm smile. "Hey," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "How'd it go?" Mildred followed him into the kitchen, where the scent of spaghetti sauce lingered in the air. She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "It didn't go the way I expected," she admitted. Lance tilted his head, concern flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath. "The job, it's not what I thought it would be. They want someone who can dedicate their whole life to it. Weekends, late nights, everything. I'd hardly have time for myself, let alone anyone else." Lance watched her carefully. "So what are you going to do?" Mildred's gaze softened as she looked at him. "I'm not taking it." His eyebrows lifted in surprise. "You're sure?" She nodded. "I thought I wanted this, but now I realize what matters more. Lance, I've already found something that makes me happy. You, Amelia, Rosie. Being part of this little family. I don't want to trade that for a job that would pull me away." For a moment, Lance said nothing. Then he stepped closer, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "Mildred, I don't know what to say. You mean a lot to us too." Before either of them could say more, Amelia peeked around the corner. "Miss Mildred, are you staying for dinner?" Mildred laughed, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. "If it's okay with your dad, I'd love to." Lance smiled, his chest filling with warmth. "Of course it's okay." As they sat around the table that night, the conversation was filled with laughter and stories. Mildred felt a sense of belonging that she hadn't experienced in years, and as she looked around at the smiling faces, she knew she had made the right choice. After dinner, when the girls had gone to bed, Lance and Mildred sat on the porch, the quiet hum of cicadas filling the air. "You didn't have to do this for us," Lance said, breaking the silence. "I didn't," Mildred replied. "I did it for me. This is where I want to be, Lance, with you." He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. "I'm glad you're here," he said softly. And for the first time in years, Mildred felt a sense of peace, a certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. If you enjoyed our love story, help support our channel by like and subscribe.